They whispered of the bet long before the ink dried on memory. Florida, 1811. The air hung heavy, damp with the perfume of rot and cane, the kind of heat that stuck to a man's pride as much as to his skin. The nights in that land did not cool, they festered. And on one of those nights, in the grand house on the hill, where chandeliers swayed slightly in the wet air and tobacco smoke curled like snakes, men of wealth gathered to drink and to wound with words. Their laughter was thick with rum, reckless with arrogance, the kind of laughter that made cruelty sound like sport. It began as a dare tossed across the table. Someone spoke of the cook, Eliza, the woman who moved quietly through the house, hands steady, eyes down, never raising her voice. She was not a woman to them, not in their minds, but a shadow with skill, a servant whose silence made them feel louder. One voice, slurred with drink, suggested a wager that would outlive the night. Would the master, proud and restless, marry her? The table stilled for a moment, then erupted into applause, cruel, merciless applause. A marriage not born of love, not of faith, not of covenant, but of mockery. The master leaned back, lips twisted, arrogance painting every inch of him. He declared he would do it, not for love, not for her, but because he could, because power in that world was not about command, but about degradation, about proving that human life could be bent in a theater. And so the bet was struck, sealed with whiskey and laughter, carved into the marrow of the night. By dawn, word spread faster than fire in the cane fields. The enslaved whispered it with dread in the quarters. Townsfolk hissed it with scandal in the markets. Some crossed themselves, others spat, but all understood. Something grotesque had been set into motion. And at the center of it, Eliza said nothing. She stirred the pot, as she always had, her face calm, unreadable, as though she had known all along that tragedy had chosen her name. The vows were spoken without bells, without blessing, only jeers. A ring placed not as a bond, but as a brand. Yet even as the men laughed, the night air felt different. Silence grew thicker, like fog rolling in off the swamp. Something had shifted, something neither master nor slave could control. And in that silence, the legend began. She became a bride not with lace, nor blessing, nor music, but with silence. Eliza walked into the union bound not by rings or words, but by chains invisible, the kind that bit deeper than iron ever could. By day she remained in the kitchen, her hands steady over the pot, seasoning the very meals of the men who had turned her life into a wager. Their eyes followed her with mocking curiosity, measuring her not as a wife, nor even as a woman, but as the embodiment of a cruel joke. Each glance was a cut, each smirk a lash sharper than the whip. Yet her face betrayed nothing. By night, the spectacle became stranger. She sat across from a master at his long dining table, a candle flickering between them. The silver gleamed, the food cooled, and the silence swelled like a living thing. He did not see her as a partner, nor as a victim, not yet. To him, she was only proof of his boast, the flesh and blood echo of his arrogance. Yet sometimes, as the hours dragged into midnight, his eyes lingered too long upon her. He studied her silence with unease, as though afraid of what strength might hide beneath it. The enslaved watched her passage through the house with downcast eyes, torn between pity and dread. They saw how she carried herself, shoulders straight, movements calm, and it unsettled them. In her quiet, there was something unyielding, something that hinted at defiance too dangerous to name. To acknowledge it aloud might summon doom, and so they lowered their heads, whispering only when the night was thickest. Beyond the cane fields, the town spoke of scandal. The church bells tolled for the weddings of others, never for hers. Children were hushed when they asked why a slave wore a ring. In the pews on Sunday, whispers slipped between hymns. The master had tainted the sanctity of marriage, had mocked God himself by making a jest of the altar. Yet even the righteous dared not confront him. Power was a shield thicker than faith. Eliza bore it all with a strange dignity, neither bending nor breaking. Her silence became a wall none could climb, a storm none could predict. And storms, when they gather, do not stay hidden forever. They wait, they build, they break. One night, as the candles guttered low and the house groaned against the humid wind, the master looked across the table into her eyes and saw something he could not name. For the first time, his hand trembled against the stem of his glass. And still, she said nothing. The night of the feast came heavy with heat, the kind that clung to skin like damp cloth and made the air taste of iron. The master called the men again, summoning them to his grand home as if to parade his triumph once more. Candles blazed across the dining room, their flames trembling in the thick air. Wine flowed too freely, meat roasted until the walls sweated with grease and smoke, and laughter rose like a cruel hymn. Eliza moved among them like a shadow tethered to firelight. Her steps were soundless on the wooden floor, her face calm as she poured their glasses, served their plates, endured their words. For these were the same men who had wagered her life like dice across the table, and now they laughed in her presence as though she were not flesh, not heart, not soul, but entertainment carved into silence. One leaned too close, asking if she had ever spoken, his breath sour with drink. Another reached for her wrist, mocking the band of gold that circled it, calling it nothing but a shackle in disguise. The master laughed with them, though the sound rang thinner than before. His smile was sharpened for their benefit, but beneath the performance flickered unease. For her silence had become heavier than words, more cutting than any insult he could summon. He raised his glass as though to prove command, but his gaze betrayed the tremor of a man unsettled by something he could not name. At the hearth, where the fire glowed and cracked against the stone, Eliza paused. The room seemed to hush of its own accord. Slowly, she lifted her eyes, not hurried, not defiant, simply steady. For the first time that evening, she looked into the faces of the men who had traded her dignity for laughter. And one by one, their voices faltered. The jokes curdled into silence. The wine seemed bitter. The smoke hung too thick in their throats. No rage flickered in her gaze, no plea, no tear. What she offered was colder, a mirror, a reflection of their cruelty laid bare in her stillness. It was enough to make their throats dry and their hands restless against the tablecloth. The laughter never recovered that night. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls that seemed to crawl and whisper. Something invisible had shifted, something neither rum nor bravado could drown. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the house had chosen to hold its breath. And in that breathless silence, the men felt it, a presence pressing down, a storm gathering just beyond the walls. Rumors began to crawl like vines through the quarters, wrapping themselves around every whispered prayer and every sleepless night. They said Eliza had not always been silent. Long ago, before scars carved themselves into her life, she had sung in the fields. Her voice had carried over the rows of cane like smoke, a mournful hymn that gave rhythm to weary hands and cracked backs. Even those who bent beneath the lash swore her voice had softened their suffering, if only for a moment. But one evening, an overseer silenced her with the back of his hand. Her song fell still, and silence grew in its place. Her life had been broken again and again. A husband, another slave, sold south with no warning, his hands torn from hers as if they had never touched. A child, taken from her arms, vanished into a world that saw profit in grief. Her cries had echoed through the fields that night, raw and endless, but no one came. No one ever came. And when morning broke, her voice was gone, folded into her chest where no whip could reach it. She never sang again. Now, bound in this cruel parody of marriage, her silence carried all that memory. It was not emptiness, but weight. Every loss, every humiliation, every scar pressed into a wordless hymn only she could hear. To the enslaved, she became more than a cook, more than a woman. She was a shadow that walked among them, a living ghost who reminded them of what could never be erased. When they looked at her, they did not see weakness. They saw endurance, though they dared not say it aloud. To the master, she became something he could not understand. At night, when he looked at her across the candlelight, her silence returned his gaze with the weight of every cruelty he had inflicted. He had thought the bet would amuse, that making her his wife would brand her as nothing more than his possession. But instead, he had created something he could not name, something that unsettled him in his own house. The whispers in town deepened. Some called her cursed. Others claimed the master had cursed himself. What began as laughter was turning into suspicion. For those who watched her pass in silence, there was the uncanny sense that the very air bent around her, that the night held its breath when she entered. And when storms began to gather too often over the fields, when lightning lingered longer than the sky should bear, some swore it was not weather at all, but memory itself, darkening above the house. The plantation itself began to shift, as if the earth beneath it had grown restless. Tools splintered without cause, wheels broke, and the air in the quarters grew thick with unease. Storms came more often than they should, rolling in from the swamps with black clouds that clung to the sky longer than any farmer dared to remember. The enslaved worked under thunder that cracked like a warning, and every bolt of lightning seemed to strike closer to the great house on the hill. Townsfolk felt it too. Word of the strange union had already spread like rot through the church pews and market stalls, but now their whispers sharpened. They spat the word which under their breath, afraid to speak louder, afraid to invite her gaze. Children were hushed at her name. Women refused to meet her eyes when she passed, clutching their rosaries tighter as if silence itself could curse them. They said no bet made in cruelty could end without consequence. And in their hearts, they feared the consequence had already arrived. Some swore they saw her standing at her window when the moon was high, unmoving, watching the cane fields as though she could summon fire with her stare. On nights when storms rolled in, others whispered of a sound, a humming, low and mournful, carried by the wind. It was not a hymn, not a song, but something between lament and warning. They said it was her voice returning, a ghostly thread unspooled into the night, a sound that made even dogs whimper and retreat. The very men who had once applauded the bet began to murmur their regret. They warned the master in uneasy tones that he had gone too far, that a man might command labor but could not command fate. Yet pride is a flame that burns hotter than reason, and the master clung to his arrogance as though it were armor. He told them she was nothing but a woman, a possession, a servant who had been turned into a jest for their amusement. But even as he said it, his jaw tightened, his eyes restless, for he too felt the weight pressing against his house. And through it all, Eliza remained silent, her footsteps steady, her gaze steady, her presence heavier than any word. It was no longer a marriage, nor even a wager. It had become something darker, a haunting that crept along the walls and whispered through the rafters. The bet that once filled men with laughter now filled them with dread. For in the silence, something was waiting, and it was moving closer. The night broke open with rain. It lashed against the fields in sheets, hammering the cane into the mud, rattling the shutters of the great house until the walls groaned. Thunder rolled heavy enough to shake the ground, and lightning painted the sky white, then darker still. Inside, the master staggered through the corridors, his boots heavy with drink, his face flushed with anger. The laughter of his peers still echoed in his ears, cruel reminders that they whispered he was ruled not by strength but by silence, by the woman who sat across his table without a word. He could not bear it. The jeers carved deeper than any wound, gnawing at his pride until rage consumed him. His footsteps pounded down the hall toward the kitchen, where the fire burned low against the storm. There she stood, as she always did, her hands steady at the stove, her back straight, her face calm in the flickering glow. She did not turn when he entered, nor when his voice thundered louder than the storm itself. He demanded her obedience, demanded her voice. He shouted her name like a curse, striking the wooden table with his hand until the pots rattled. Still, she did not answer. His fury swelled, a wave breaking. He struck her then, the sound sharp against the walls, his hand trembling as it fell. Yet even as pain blossomed across her face, she made no sound. Not a cry, not a gasp. Nothing. She straightened, meeting his eyes with a gaze that burned steady in the storm's flashing light. In that silence, he felt something colder than defiance. He felt every ghost his cruelty had ever created. Every lash, every sail, every cry that went unanswered seemed to gather in her eyes, staring back at him, unflinching. For the first time, fear seized him, not of her hands, not of her body, but of her silence, which rose like thunder greater than his own voice. He stumbled backward, shaken, his anger faltering beneath the weight of what he could not conquer. The storm outside wailed against the windows, but inside the house it was her silence that roared the loudest. Something broke that night. Whether it was in him or in her, no one could say. But the household never forgot the way the master left the kitchen, pale and unsteady, his pride shattered. Nor did they forget how she remained behind, standing tall in the fire's glow, her silence heavier than thunder, heavier than death itself. The storm passed, but its shadow lingered. Days later, the master summoned the household to the long dining hall, as though he could stitch dignity back into his unraveling name with ceremony and ritual. The table stretched heavy with roasted meats and stews, the finest wine uncorked, candles lined like sentries. He invited his peers, the very men who had once cheered his wager, their laughter brittle now, their eyes darting toward her even before they dared look at him. Eliza was seated at the far end of the table. No servant's place, no honored seat, just there, as if the house itself had demanded her presence. Her dress was plain, her posture straight, her face carved with that same unshakable stillness. She ate nothing. She drank nothing. Her silence lay across the room like a veil no one could lift. The men tried to speak. They filled their mouths with gossip, with scripture, with uneasy laughter, but their words fell flat, swallowed by the weight of her gaze. Forks clinked against plates, hands trembled on wine cups. One by one, they faltered, their voices catching as though her silence had stolen the very air from their lungs. The master drank harder, his movements jagged, his jaw tight. He spoke louder than he needed to, each word flung like a stone meant to break the quiet. He mocked her, taunted her, demanded she speak, demanded she remember her place. But every challenge met the same response. Nothing. Her eyes never lowered. Her face never changed. The storm had passed outside, but inside the hall, its silence raged on. Some said she was not human in that moment, that she had become something else, a mirror in which every cruelty, every betrayal, every sin of the table reflected back at them. The laughter of the bet, the lash of the whip, the prayers muttered in church pews while bodies bent in the fields, all of it seemed to hang above the candles, shimmering like smoke. One guest rose suddenly, muttering an excuse, unwilling to endure it any longer. Another followed. Soon the long table stood half empty, the feast untouched. Only the master remained, his face pale with fury and shame, his cup clutched as though it were the last piece of himself he could hold. And at the far end of the table, Eliza remained, silent, still, and unmovable. That night, no one slept easily, for silence had feasted more fully than any man at the table. The feast ended, but the silence did not. In the days that followed, the great house seemed to rot from within. Servants whispered of footsteps in the halls when no one walked, of doors swinging open though no wind stirred. At night, the master drank until he collapsed, muttering her name as though it clung to him like a chain. Some swore they heard him weeping, though he denied it by day. Others claimed he had taken to locking every door, as if wood and iron could bar what he feared most. And then she was gone. No one saw her leave. No horse carried her. No road bore her steps. One evening she was there, her silence thick as the storm, and by morning her chair was empty. The master tore through the quarters, the fields, even the swamps, calling her name in a voice raw with rage and something darker, dread. But she was nowhere. The cane stood unbroken, the soil undisturbed. She had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace but absence. The townsfolk whispered that the bet had been collected at last, that the devil himself had come for her, or that the land, tired of swallowing blood, had claimed her silence as its own. Others said she still lingered, not in flesh but in shadow, that on certain nights, when the storms roll thick over Florida and lightning splits the sky, you can see her figure in the cane fields, standing as still as the moment she defied him. Children were warned never to wander the swamps after dark. Women crossed themselves when thunder rattled their shutters. And men who once laughed at the wager spoke her name no more, for fear her silence might follow them home. As for the master, his end came slow and bitter. His pride corroded into madness, his voice broken to whispers, until he too was swallowed by the earth. Yet none wept for him, for the story had already left him behind. What lingered was not his cruelty, but her silence, the silence that became legend. And so the tale passed from mouth to mouth, a shadow stitched into the fabric of Florida's soil. They say if you walk the fields on a storm-lit night, when the thunder shakes the earth and the air smells of iron and rain, you might hear it still. Not a cry, not a song, but a hush so heavy it presses against your chest. They say it is her silence, waiting, unbroken, and it will never let them forget.